Welcome to Wisdom for Life, where we sit through philosophy to find practical advice that you can use in your everyday life. Hi, I'm Dan Hayes. I'm joined by my co-host, Dr. Greg Sadler. This time, we have a special guest, Carneades.
So, Carneades is obviously a pseudonym. Nobody's really named that. But it is a real-life person on here, and he is the author of a recent book, Are All Lives Equal? Why Cost-Benefit Analysis Values Rich Lives More, and How Philosophy Can Fix It, which is a bit of a mouthful. And you're going to get to know him pretty well in this episode. He also has an educational YouTube channel that is focused on philosophy, and he's been doing that for close to 10 years. He's got over 13 million views. He's approaching 125,000 subscribers. We might pass that up tonight or in the near future. And he's got almost 1,000 videos. And he's also got a really well put together educational website, Carneades.org. We'll put a link to that in the show notes for anybody who'd like to go check that out. We both highly recommend that. So, Carneades, anything else that you want to say by way of introduction? There's a lot of other things that, even with your pseudonym, I think we could have said. What else would you like to say about yourself?
Sure. Well, first, I'd like to say thank you so much for having me on the show and chatting with me today about the book. I'm sure we'll get into some of this, but excited to be talking about philosophy, exciting to be talking with people who work in doing public philosophy and engaging folks. I do, in my day-to-day life, do work in international development that we'll chat about a little bit. I've worked for the World Bank. I've worked for the Gates Foundation. I've worked for a couple of U.S. government international assistant agencies. So that's kind of my day job. And then my life outside of that is doing educational philosophy. So, a little bit of the dual side of that that I think maybe we'll get a chance to talk about here today.
Yeah.
So
go ahead.
I got a question. Is it all you now, or do you have a team with your YouTube channel?
That is a great question. When I started the YouTube channel, I was like, maybe one day I'll have a team. So I want to frame this in terms of we. And so often I'll say we at Carneades.org do these things. It is 100% just me that produces these things, and it's only me. I do say that we still kind of to give myself this feeling of like there's more people working on this. It's really just me that's putting these together.
The aspirational we.
Exactly.
I asked you that exactly because I heard you referring to yourself. I believe both in the book as well as a couple of the videos I saw of you as we.
Oh, yeah.
It's
an aspirational we, for sure.
I hate to begin with a digression, but I'm going to, which is that I'm kind of curious on your end, Carneades. So I get pitches because I have a YouTube channel, and we're almost like at the same exact level. Interestingly enough, I get pitches every single week from somebody who thinks that they're going to make my life easier, but they would complicate my work significantly were I to bring them on board. They want to help me out with thumbnails, or they want to help me with SEO or stuff like that. And I don't have a team either. And I kind of feel like I don't want to have a team because it would take too long to train anybody in doing the kind of work that I do. Is that the same for you?
Oh, 100%, completely. I feel that there might be some point, and there's definitely a point where some YouTubers get to where it's clear that the amount of, whether it's editing work or something else that they do, bringing someone on, it would be useful. But I also get offers for people who say, oh, I want to do these various things for your videos, help you with editing, help you with that. And I'm like, the amount of work it would take for me to do that is so much more than me just doing some of these processes myself. So I'm definitely in the same boat on that.
Have you ever had anyone who tried to pitch being an intern for you? Because I've had that a few times.
I haven't had that one.
Same sort of logic, though. I thought, it would take so much work to bring them up to speed. I don't know if this would be valuable for me.
Yeah, completely agree. But
that's why you have universities for TAs.
Well, do you think there's? So here's another digression point. But do you think there's something about doing public philosophy that makes it less easy to bring somebody in and just help out than it would be with like cat videos or, I don't know, little quotes or stuff like that?
I think it's a good question. I think, and this is a little bit gets to kind of my philosophy, for lack of a better word, of making videos, which is around, I try to center the ideas and the arguments and do as little as possible as I can on kind of the fancy editing or making everything look nice. If you've seen my videos, they're very basic. They're very simple. And that is by design to a certain degree, in part because I want to center the ideas and in part because I don't want to spend all of my time doing video editing. And so I wonder if philosophy by nature being something that tries to center those ideas and concepts lends itself to people who say, we want to talk about the ideas, having something with the best graphics or the best transitions isn't going to give us that much value add, but I don't know.
I mean, there are some big philosophy channels out there that I call it glitz, you know, they spend a lot of time on the glitz and maybe less time on really good content. And they have lots of, I mean, they make us look like little tiny pygmies
we're 2-bit
exactly,
compared to that.
Compared to, you know, and I won't like, you know, name names or anything. People can find them easily enough. I mean, so let me ask you this. We were like so far off script at this point, but as somebody who does public philosophy, I mean, you have a massive range as well. So you know your stuff, you know a lot of other people's stuff. When you look at those channels, do you find them interesting or useful? These big, high production, kind of low content channels where it's much more about like dramatization or, you know, making up scenarios or, you know, that sort of thing. Do you find that interesting at all, or do you see that as like, it's not really philosophy anymore?
I see those things in the same way I feel as I read plays by Sartre or something. I see them as someone who understands the philosophy ideas well enough to produce something that is engaging for a broad audience that maybe connects with those ideas and touches on them and riffs on them. And so I see them fit into more almost an artistic space than directly a philosophy space. And when I see them as that, they're engaging and interesting for me because I look at them almost with an aesthetic lens of how are you telling this story or doing these things, and then they become interesting. But if I look at them with kind of that strict just, is this clearly dictating philosophy? I say, I don't know how much there is there. But when I look at them kind of in the frame of this is someone that has a background in philosophy that's giving me an artistic piece that maybe has bits of philosophy in it, then I find I'm more engaged with it.
So it
all depends upon the telos or the ends which they're actually trying to go for and how well they've actually executed on those.
Yeah. And they could be a good gateway into better philosophy, in other words. Yeah.
Oh, don't get too much in your little ivory tower there, Drake.
Yeah, we're gonna start gatekeeping from Riverwest Radio. Well, let's come back to some of the things that we were originally going to ask you about before we get to the book, which will I think have plenty of time. So, why use a pseudonym and keep your face off of your own videos? You know, clearly you're not in it for the fame, right, or the celebrity.
Yeah, good question. So the work that I do in my day job takes me to a lot of places around the world, and it puts me in situations where I am in countries that are often hostile to people that are non-religious. Being a philosophical skeptic is a part of my channel, and not being religious is a part of that. And so critiquing any number of sources of knowledge, including religion, is a part of my channel. And there are a lot of countries that I work in and have worked in where that's illegal and that can be punished. And so I try to, as much as I can, keep my personality online and my personality out in the real world separate to a certain degree, both for personal safety, but also to kind of help preserve the work that I'm doing in my day job and not have too much crossover or get judged by people that say, oh, we're aware of you online in some way.
So it's essentially a secret identity. right? Like with
To a certain
superheroes.
degree. To a certain degree. It's not. I try not to guard it too jealously for people that I actually know in person. But I just.
Yeah.
I'm a little cautious of having it out there somewhere where someone can search it and be like, "Oh, this person said all of these things." And
do you have to tell the people that you know in person who know that you are Carneades that they shouldn't reveal your identity?
I
usually
try to tell people that keep it separate, keep it distinct, and usually. I mean, so much of everything that we do is online right now. I say, if you're talking to someone in person, like have it in person, it's fine. But it's amazing what people can find out about you on the internet. Like I was like, oh, I don't have a Wikipedia page. I'm fine. But there's like Wikitubia that has Wikipedia pages for everyone that has a certain size YouTube channel out there. And they've listed a surprising number of pieces of information about me on there.
That's interesting.
It was surprising and shocking to me. I was like, let me just be as careful as I can with this. So a bit of a secret identity, but not too much.
Yeah.
So to try to maybe not probe yourself so much as your alter ego here is so you said that skepticism is a big part of your channel. Mm-hmm. We know that Carneades or Carneades, depending on how you want to read the Greek there, is a name of an ancient skeptic. Mm-hmm. Why did you choose him?
Great question. So I was aware that I wanted kind of an ancient Greek skeptic to play with. And I was playing with a couple of them. I was reading some of these old stories and anecdotes about these different skeptics. And there was this one story about Carneades that really struck me, which is there's a story of he and a number of other scholarks. So Carneades was a scholark of Plato's Academy, of the Skeptical Academy, and he and a number of other scholarks went to Rome to present as an embassy to present an Athenian petition to the Roman Senate. And the story goes that he presented to the Roman Senate and spoke to the senators and the people. And the first day he came, he spoke all of these Platonic arguments for justice and in favor of Plato's traditional conceptions of justice. And they were wowed and impressed by his oratory skills. But then the next day he came and he completely debunked all of the arguments that he had just presented and went in the other direction and showed all the flaws in the things he had presented and said all these things against his own arguments. And the Roman senators were so shocked by this and were so concerned that these Greek philosophers were coming on and spreading these dangerous ideas of free thinking and being able to question ideas that they immediately granted the Athenian petition and sent the philosophers home, lest they corrupt the minds of the Roman youth. And so that story struck me because I liked that idea of being able to argue both sides of an idea and being able to present things from different angles. And I would say my own skepticism doesn't certainly perfectly align with Carneades. He's more of an academic skeptic. I'm more of a Pyrrhonian skeptic. But that story and that idea of kind of presenting both sides and pushing from both sides was something that was really impactful for me. And I wanted to kind of bring that to bear. And I was aware Carneades was a little known figure. And so I was able to kind of take on a moniker that people wouldn't have other associations with strongly.
Like Cicero, right? Or
yeah, exactly.
Aristotle. So there's all sorts of Aristotle accounts out there on Twitter that are just awful. Where you're like, Aristotle wouldn't have said this nonsense that you're saying. I was interested in asking you about the both sides thing, but I think for our listeners, it might be useful to ask you, so what's the difference between Pyrrhonian skepticism and academic skepticism? Because those aren't terms that they've probably heard, although they could go to your channel and easily find videos talking about that, right?
Yeah. So I can speak to it a little bit. I mean, there are two traditions that I think it's, I want to say it's Sextus Empiricus that outlines kind of these two traditions within skepticism and kind of defines himself against the academic skeptics. But it's the idea of, you think, if we categorize everyone that's not a skeptic as someone that thinks that I have knowledge or I know something, then you have academic skeptics that thinks knowledge is impossible. They assent to the claim and accept the claim that knowledge is impossible or you cannot have any knowledge at all. And then Pyrrhonian skeptics suspend judgment on that claim. So you have people that say, yes, knowledge is possible, no, knowledge is impossible, and people that say, I don't know if knowledge is possible. it's kind of if you want a very basic kind of slimmed down dichotomy of the positions, it's that. And so the Pyrrhonian skeptics fit more in the world of lacking belief and trying to seek kind of ataraxia or a lack of beliefs, and this state of suspension, complete suspension of judgment, whereas the academic skeptics are more in the realm of arguing for the specific claim that knowledge is impossible.
Okay. Yeah,
is how I would explain it, at least.
I think that's quite helpful. Yeah. So the both sides thing, why do you see that as, I mean, you could be accused of both sidesism, right? Mm-hmm. And this is something completely different than that technique. What is it about presenting both sides or multiple sides that you find compelling or valuable?
That's a great question. I'd say that it's compelling to me because I think it is getting too into a specific position or too into a certain dogma. You can end up with blinders on. You can end up blind to weaknesses to your own argument, and you can be put into a world where you accept, you get kind of cognitive biases where you say, oh, I'm just going to accept the piece of evidence that confirm my argument and I'm going to ignore the ones that don't. And I think it's a dangerous mental space to get in when you have kind of accepted something and you don't look at the other side of a given argument. You can become dogmatically committed to something. And when you try to, at least in terms of your beliefs, look at both sides of something and say, what are the reasons that I could doubt this thing? What are the reasons that go against this? How can I balance this argument out? I think it can lead to a headspace that lets you be a little bit free of some of those dogmas and not kind of be so attached to something that if new information came, you wouldn't be able to question it. So I think that's a piece of it. I think it's also, honestly, there's not as much from the both sides side, but just the general skepticism side. I think there's a calming sense for me of the possibility that I might be wrong. I think some people get very nervous about that. For me, when something is going bad in the world, like the possibility that I could be dreaming or the possibility that I could be in the Matrix, that makes me happy. That makes me calm. When something goes horribly wrong, I say, you know what? I might wake up tomorrow and this all might be different. And that I find a lot of peace in that. So I think there's a couple of those things that go into the skepticism for me.
That's very interesting because I think that's probably a minority thing, but it does make a lot of sense. What were you going to say, Dan?
I agree fairly wholeheartedly with what Carneades just said there, that I try to hold myself to that my ideas are not me, and that these two things must be separated, because if they become me, then when someone attacks my ideas, I will see them as attacking me.
Yeah, that emotional investment, right?
Right.
Yeah.
To try to be as low dogma as possible. I don't know if there's any way to be totally free of dogma as a human being. But specifically, do you have any practices, philosophical practices that you use to try to elicit this state within yourself? So we've talked about a number of different practices here within our own show, and if you got one to share, I'd be love to hear it.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely to speak to it to a certain degree. I mean, I love going through, if I'm in a situation where I have that kind of moment of feeling overinvested in something, being able to take that step back and almost away from myself and say, what if I were a minor part character in someone else's story? What if I were just dreaming now? What if I were in this different situation where my experience isn't centered in this and someone else's experience is what's centered? And I don't know, I've had, not to get too weird and mystical, but through my life, I feel like I'm sometimes able to have these not out of body experiences, but experiences where I can step back from myself and say, I'm just someone that's living this experience or seeing these things through this very narrow lens, very narrow ideology. I could be wrong. I could be in this situation. And so taking that pause, taking that step back, and even just thinking of like, if this were a dream, would everything be, and I woke up in a moment, would everything be as intense and as horrible as or bad as I think it is right now? And I think that idea of even just going through skeptical scenarios and these ideas of what if I was being deceived can bring me and does bring me a lot of peace. So I don't know if that's a perfect practice that anyone else can use, but I think thinking through some of those possible skeptical scenarios sometimes can bring me peace of, oh, maybe this isn't as bad as I think it is.
Well, I mean, it brings up something, and this is a technical term, from Greek philosophy that you're very familiar with, the epoche, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's originally associated with skepticism and then makes its way into phenomenology through Edmund Husserl and other people taking that terminology and bringing it in and using it to mean something a bit different. But what you're doing there does sound like something in between the original skeptical, suspending judgment, point of which is to, make you live a better life, not just to be a devil's advocate all the time or something like that, but also the phenomenological one where you do, like you said, you think about how things could be different, and you're not just thinking about in you could say a purely objective way. Oh, the outside world, what, like Husserl did all these really, really boring variations of, well, what if the red ball was green, or had a green dot and stuff like that. But you could think about okay, so what if I, what if I was older? What if I was younger? What if I was a different gender? How would I be seeing things? And what you're varying is more your personality and your background and your, what would you call it? Your identity, right?
Yeah.
And saying what's the world like then?
So for our viewers, could you define that term? Epoche?
Oh, epoche. I'll let Carneades do it because
I don't know if I do a good job. Please go ahead if you have a good definition for us.
Well, I mean, so it literally means to hold back, hold from something. And it was, it was this term that the skeptics used for withholding judgment, for not immediately buying into things. And I mean, you do see this in other philosophies like the Stoics when they talk about not immediately accepting fantasiae or appearances or imaginations as what they are. But the skeptics obviously took it much further, right? It's absolutely central to what they're doing. So what do you think, Dan? Does that work?
Pretty well.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's good enough for what we need to go through. I guess the only other thought I can think of is, I don't know, this was from an author. I was reading about her author and how she was motivating herself to write her books, was that she would create another personality, and she named it for herself, that was the one that was kicking her butt to do the thing. I'm thinking could you hold okay, I'm gonna have Bob here. I'm going to argue as Bob here for this argument over here, and I'm going to argue as James as this argument over here, and I'm going to be the arbiter, and think of myself as the one that's in the middle, and looking at these two different people putting up their best steel mans of their particular arguments.
That's actually a really interesting way to frame it. So is that how a skeptic could set things up for themselves as not just a writer, but going through day to day? You've got, I don't want to say the angel and the devil on your shoulder. It's more a sort of view on one side and a sort of view on the other side that brings out different aspects of a situation.
Yeah, and I think that some people can do this, and some skeptics do this with really thinking of real people who they're aware of that do disagree on these things. I think we often all know that, and those people who may disagree with us, or who are our best opponents, or people who would always argue with us. And so imagining those people, even of saying that I know, I don't know, within politics, you have one political thing, you know that relative that's on the other side of the political spectrum, not saying of coming up with that person that perhaps in the best light, what would they argue? What would they say? What's the conversation that they would have back to me with that strongest steel man? And so I think you can even embody those ideas further and say, who's that person that I know that would present a really good argument against me, who would always be able to catch where I'm doing something wrong and would expose those holes, so that I can, whether that's make my argument better or arrive at a state of lack of belief, what have you. I think there's definitely benefits to that.
I find I've used this technique in learning foreign languages like Spanish. I create a persona. It's me, but the Spanish-speaking version of me. And it definitely helps, especially getting into like the voice of it. But I also find that I can usually recall arguments of other people if I'm either thinking their voice or I might be even impersonating them. And I wonder if there's if you can kind of even step into their shoes, it allows you to hone that idea that they're holding in a little bit better way.
Mm-hmm. I know actors talk about that a lot, of being able to, you get into the physicality of an individual, you get into the voice of someone, you're better able to understand their objectives and their ideas and put yourself in a different frame of reference than you would if you're just embodying yourself.
That's very interesting. I mean, maybe down the line we should have you on as a guest and just talk through skepticism.
Yeah.
Because we do have to move on a bit. I wanted to before we get into the book, which we will get into, doing philosophy on YouTube. So you've been doing it now for about 10 years. What made you want to start doing that in the first place? What got you? I mean, it's public philosophy that you're doing, right? It's not just purely academic. Dan invoked the term ivory tower earlier, which a lot of people are doing and doing quite poorly on YouTube.
So I would say I remember when I started the channel that I had seen things out there that looked like, I don't know, Khan Academy or these other educational YouTube channels that were focused on other concepts, whether that's math, whether that's English, whether that's something else, to help people learn. And I also remember as a kid, before I ever set foot in a philosophy classroom, I thought a lot about philosophy but didn't have a name for it. I thought a lot about these ideas, and I remember stepping into a philosophy classroom for the first time and being like, these are the people who are talking about the things that I've thought about my entire life. And so I wanted to, doing public philosophy, give people who never get the chance to go into a philosophy classroom, but have some of those questions, who are thinking about whether that's epistemology or metaphysics, but don't have the names for those things. Give them the opportunity to say, I have this kind of idea of something I'm curious about, but I'm not going to be able to get a degree in philosophy or take a philosophy class and be able to still engage with those concepts. Because I think, from my perspective, philosophy is something that we all should have access to and we should be able to do. And people should be able to learn about ethics and justice that are so important to people's lives, but not everyone gets the chance to study academic philosophy or philosophy in a professional setting. And so I wanted to have a place where people who think hard about these things, but maybe never have the chance to do formal philosophy, could engage and could learn a little bit or get their feet wet a bit with some of the videos that I have, so that they could maybe take the next step on their own.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. Now, another question that I had for you. So 10 years in almost, there's a lot of people who do not just philosophy, but other things in the humanities on YouTube, and they kind of peter out after a year or two. It's like they run out of ideas or they run out of energy. And you're doing this on the side. You're doing this kind of moonlighting rather than as your full-time gig. So what has kept you persevering in it to the point where you've now got almost 1,000 videos?
That's a great question. So I remember when I first started the channel, I wanted this to be something that I never looked at as a chore. I wanted it to be something I was always excited to do. And it's not to say it has never felt that way, or a little bit, but I wanted to have my videos be low enough budget and basic enough that I felt I could always be excited to do another one, and that I wouldn't spend all of my time doing video editing and fancy graphics and all of this stuff. Because I see these channels as well, and I hear from people that start a philosophy channel and have made 2 videos and then stop, and they're these highly produced, fancy, beautiful videos on a couple of concepts, and then they just disappear and drop off the face of the earth. And so I didn't want to be in that place. And so I wanted to do something that would always be easy for me to do, but also would always center kind of the ideas and the concepts. And so I could spend my time doing the thing that I love, which is learning about philosophy, engaging with philosophers and engaging with those ideas, and not sitting around video editing or staring at a video editing software or sound editing software. Not to say I don't do that sometimes, but having that. And so I think I've been able to keep up the pace of videos and the videos I've done because I've kept it fairly basic when it comes to the frills and the extra stuff.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting because when I was, doing the research for this session and looking at your channel, we're almost, your channel and my channel are almost like parallel to each other in terms of, time in, growth, number of subscribers, number of views, and we're doing pretty similar stuff. Like you were just saying, not spending a ton of time on video editing and really concentrating on making good content. Stuff that people could use. People use my videos in classes. I've used some of your videos in my classes as resources for my students. And it strikes me that, like in some YouTube, let's call them niches or segments, whatever the word is, that would put us like in direct competition with each other, right? You and I would be rivals, but in a way, like what we're doing is complementary. I think somebody could watch one of your videos and then watch one of my videos, and they would, they could both be on the same text, the same thinker, the same topic and concept. And it's not like, you would have your rival view over here and I would have my rival take over here. We could actually be saying almost the same thing, and yet somebody could derive some surplus benefit from it, maybe.
For sure. I mean, I'm sure you see this in comments on your videos, but I often see people who say, I listened to 5 other people explain this different ways, but for something about the way that you explained this one thing is what finally made it click. And I agree completely. I think that with education, these things are additive, right? When I want to learn something on YouTube, I go and I click through the first video. And if I don't learn something there, I click to the next video and the next video. And even if I do understand the concept, getting those different perspectives and what people choose to focus on and the way they choose to frame it, I think it's complementary. And I think because our goal is educating and teaching people about philosophy and doing public philosophy in that way, it is really complementary to have extra resources and have more resources for people out there. Yeah. So,
I'd be curious to know if you get a lot of comments of this sort that I got very early on, and that was part of what made me realize that it was worth doing the YouTube work. People would say, my instructor is awful. They won't explain anything. They won't answer questions. I was flunking the class. Now I'm able to pass because, you did this thing on Aristotle or whatever. Do you get a lot of those?
Yeah, those are the comments that make my day. I definitely get some of those comments. And it's great. Particularly, there'll be like some weird concept. I'll have like done a video on Bayesian epistemology that I'm like, no one's going to watch this video. And it's like a really small segment of people that I'm pitching to. And someone will say like, I took a class in this and I was having no idea. And then I watched these videos and it helped me understand or fill in the gaps of what someone wasn't saying. So yeah,
it's positive in one way, right? Because we can read it and we go, oh, I'm doing a good job, right? But it's also negative in another way because we'd be, oh, there's an awful lot of either bad or poorly informed or lazy instructors out there in academia, which is not a good thing. We want those people out.
True.
But thankfully, both of you are here to help pick up the slack.
Well, we should talk. Go ahead, Dan.
Oh yeah, well, I was just gonna say, like,
let's talk about the book.
Like it's book time. So we've got this book.
Yeah.
Yes. So the subtitle again for our listeners. The book is called "Are All Lives Equal?" Right, and then the subtitle is this longish: "Why Cost-Benefit Analysis Values Rich Lives More and How Philosophy Can Fix It." And I kind of think that between the title and the subtitle, it's really well chosen because it kind of explains what the whole book is about, right? You don't often see that.
That's the good thing about having a subtitle that could be a small abstract on its own, is that it hopefully gets the point across and hits all of the pieces related to it. I think the book is trying to span a couple of disciplines, and so it's trying to pick up on both people that care about philosophy, but also people that care about economics, and people that are trying to get those two groups of people to talk to each other. And so I tried to highlight the fact that this isn't just a book about cost-benefit analysis. This isn't just a book about philosophy. It's a book about how philosophy can help fix what's wrong with some parts of economics and cost-benefit analysis.
I mean, it strikes me that there's a third and maybe even fourth group that are being targeted as, if not readers, at least people to have an argument made to. And you want policymakers and politicians to take this seriously, or at least for their aides maybe to read it and whisper in their ears, right? And I was wondering too, I mean, you mentioned some of these NGOs.
Which now we know that you work for.
Yeah, so I mean, they're like a fourth. NGOs, institutions, whatever is not a government itself, run by politicians. Those are people who are making decisions that massively impact our life. If you like an electrical utility, right?
I'd say there's a lot of potential audiences here, both kind of on the academic side of looking at the concepts of philosophy and economics and how they are in conversation, but also the practical application. And that some of the impetus and the push for me in writing this and trying to get it out there is from the practical side. It's from the side of I work in policy every day, and I see rooms full of economists and empty of philosophers, and I want to have there be a voice for philosophy and ethics and some of these considerations in those rooms. And so there's some desire for this to be putting philosophy or getting philosophy in the door. There's a piece that I have at the very end of the book in the final thoughts of kind of let philosophy in. And it's this plea to say a lot of these institutions have become overgrown with only people from economics as a discipline. Let some of the other humanities in, whether that's historians or philosophers or whoever, to these conversations, because I think they can become all the richer for it and get away from some of kind of the groupthink that I think has plagued some of these institutions to a certain degree.
Yeah, I like the point where you're talking about basically, if you got a whole bunch of economists and you say, okay, optimize this function. Yeah. They go, yes, sir. I'll go right to do it without actually thinking about why you're doing it in the first place. This is one of the things that I loved about when I first got introduced to philosophy in a more serious way in college. Like, I was spending all this time in computer science learning how to do these things, but not any of the arguments for why I should be doing any of these things.
Yeah. For sure.
I had a friend who was originally an economics major at Penn State, and he kept asking so many foundational questions, the whys and stuff like that, that eventually they actually told him, you need to quit asking those questions and go over to the philosophy department, because that's the slum where we send people who want to screw around with that sort of thing. And he did, and he enjoyed it very much, But I think that's kind of common that...
Oh, yeah. Economists shy away from from any normative questions, really. If you ask, should we be doing this? Economists say, oh, no, I don't touch that. Go talk to the philosophers. They push that off. And I worry that disciplines have become so siloed that, sure, it's great for philosophy because philosophy has the tools to talk about ethics and philosophy has the tools to have that conversation. But unless we kind of bring those conversations back into conversation with the people that were asking those initial questions of, wait a second, why do we make this assumption in economics still? If we don't bring those people who have the tools to ask those ethical questions in, I think you miss something and you lose something.
Yeah, and there's two sides to it. Like, I can think of a lot of my colleagues, if I'm like mentally walking down the hallway, I say at Marquette University where I teach occasionally, and imagine putting them in any sort of practical situation. It could be with economists, it could be doing business ethics, it could be doing, biomedical ethics in an actual hospital, and them just being terrible at it, and not being able to communicate effectively, and then them getting ticked off or something and going back off to their office and like thinking to themselves, see those economists, they're all bad people. Yeah. And that's almost the opposite of what you're arguing for, right? But
Yeah.
we can't just like throw any old philosophers in there because a lot of them would be almost counterproductive, right?
Yeah, and I think there's the book does try to walk this line in between, because I think that one of the mistakes economists have made is shutting out alternative views. I think that philosophers often have perhaps naive expectations about the way that the world can actually work and can effectively be used. And they come up with this beautiful theory that they say, oh, it'll work perfectly. Just go operationalize and figure out how to do this. And aren't as willing to get down into the nitty gritty of what does that actually mean? And so I think the flaw coming from the economists is excluding other disciplines and taking their assumptions and the assumptions of economics as kind of a dogma to a certain degree. But the flaw of the philosophers is saying, oh, we have this general, very abstract theory. I'm sure it'll work fine in practice. It'll be fine. I have this beautiful argument about it. It'll work fine in practice. And I think bringing those two into conversation so the philosophers can realize there may be you may have to adapt your theory to fit the world, but also the economists can realize that there may be some legitimate concerns to your basic underlying assumptions that these philosophers are raising. So I hope to challenge, in a good skeptical tradition, challenge both sides' assumptions a little bit in the discussion.
And it seems like there's also one more extra layer of you can operationalize it in a case study, but does that mean that you can actually scale that up to a large group of people?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. No.
Yeah.
That is a question. I try in the book, so I propose this slightly different methodology to use in cost-benefit analysis. And one of the critiques that I know I will get from economists and have gotten from economists that I presented this to is show us how this can be operationalized. And so I have a couple chapters where I try to show like this is really how you could, in a nitty-gritty sense, operationalize this for all of these considerations and all of these concerns that may come into play. But I can only do so much in a book without actually doing that kind of field test case.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, there's a lot of you build them as thought experiments, and they're examples essentially, like little case studies. Imagine this is the case, right?
Yeah.
And then there are two chapters that are extended case studies. One about broken windows policing and disparate impacts on communities bearing the brunt of policing, and then the whole COVID epidemic and vaccines. So I think there's a lot of case being made in the book for how this could be applied. Mm-hmm. I think it might be useful because we've mentioned cost-benefit analysis, and I don't know that all of our listeners are necessarily going to know what it means, although I think once it's explained, it's pretty intuitive, right?
Mm-hmm. Sure.
So could you run us through what cost-benefit analysis is? Or?
So I like to explain it to philosophers as what basically economists inherited the legacy of consequentialism in many ways. You'll see pictures of John Stuart Mill and Jeremy Bentham in economics departments up as founding fathers in some ways of economics. And so cost-benefit analysis is this attempt to operationalize a consequentialist calculus. Basically, you're looking at a government policy, you're saying, what's all the good that this policy is going to do? What's all the harm this policy is going to do? We're going to subtract the bad from the good, and we're going to see how much net good did we cause in the world. And there's a lot more details. Economists turn all of that into money, of course, because they're economists, and so they shift over into dollars and cents instead of kind of good and bad or pain and pleasure or what have you. And there's some issues that I raise in the book with how that conversion and how that measurement happens. But the basic idea, I think, is a really intuitive one, and it's one of the reasons that economists kind of take it as, of course, this would be a good idea to do, of let's take these, what is all the good and what is all the bad a policy is going to do, add it together and say, is this a good policy to do, or is a different policy a better policy to do?
Right. So it allows us to weigh policies against each other and compare them in ways that are, you could say, publicly accessible, right? Mm-hmm. You might not agree with the calculations and all the bases of them, but at least there's numbers that you can point to, right?
And you have a methodology that's accessible. People understand why a decision is being made. It's not a decision that's being done in a back cloakroom. It's clear that we had 3 policies. We assessed it open with public methodology that everyone knows, everyone's aware of. And this policy won. And it's clear why we might choose a particular policy because everything's open, everything's accessible. It's not that we proposed these 3 policies, a committee went into a back room and they came out with, this is the policy we're going with. And you have the potential for bias and the potential for suspicion there.
Yeah. One of the things I really like about the book is that you're not, as a lot of ethicists would be doing, or policy, advocates saying, cost-benefit analysis, not perfect, so no good. As a matter of fact, you point out at one point, I think towards the end of the book, you say philosophers need to stop letting the best be the enemy of the good, right?
The perfect,
The perfect, right.
Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Exactly. And I definitely think that. I think that philosophers often take this, let's come up with this perfect, beautiful crystalline system that may not work in the real world at all. But if there's a single flaw with this thing that we're doing, we're gonna throw it out the window and don't realize what economists might call the trade-offs, or what's the word that I'm looking for? It'll come to me. But the opportunity costs. There we go. What's the other thing that you could possibly do? What's if we're not doing this, what are we going to necessarily do as the alternative? And so what is the cost of getting rid of this thing that was actually pretty good, even though it wasn't perfect, and we end up with this thing that arguably is worse? And so
right.
Yeah, one way that you talk.
So actually,
go ahead. Dan.
So going back to your definition of the cost-benefit analysis, your little explanation of it, that was actually one of the places that I had a bit of an issue with your book. And I don't think it was mostly it wasn't your argument. It's definitely not your difference between the percentage willing to pay versus the absolute willingness to pay, which is definitely like, if there was any other subtitle, I would call it that. But when you go from the utilitarian argument of using these words specifically, welfare, happiness, utility, good, to money, I was hoping for a more thorough argument from you why you're going to actually use those terminologies, besides just kind of going, well, the utilitarians do this and we turn this into money via the economists. Especially going on, you seem to transpose these words throughout the book, and I just was going through this, like, just give me one word that we're going to use consistently here. And especially because I've read a lot about the philosophy of happiness in the last couple of years, and that is a wholly extra layer of things that is totally outside of the more smaller confines of utilitarian ideas.
No, that's a fair critique, and I think my laxness with terminology comes probably more from the economic side of how these are referred to in economics. I think economists use the word utility. They use utility to mean a specific thing, this kind of underlying concept, but they use it interchangeably with welfare. They use it interchangeably with happiness and these other things, which I agree is a problem. It's not the problem that I'm focusing on necessarily in the book, and so I'm probably a little sloppy with my terminology there. And to a certain degree, I'm being abstract and being non-specific for a reason, in that I think that there is a principal concept that underpins this, of whether that's happiness or utility or pleasure or preference or what have you. Whatever of those concepts you care the most about, I think that absolute willingness to pay does a bad job of measuring it, and percentage willingness to pay does a better job of measuring it. And so I'm a little rough with those concepts, because I think this argument can map onto whatever your favorite kind of concept is that fits in there. I think I have a small piece on it somewhere in the book where I'm like, these terms, you plug in your favorite argument here. But I definitely agree. More digging into detail on that, particularly because that connection between going from whatever that master concept that we're adding up to what we're really measuring in terms of willingness to pay is a key part of the book. Definitely is deserving of expansion.
Well, now several times we've brought up this distinction between absolute willingness to pay and percentage willingness to pay. That plays an absolutely central role in the entire argument of the book. So can you walk us through both, first of all, what are these and how do they connect to cost benefit analysis? And then how also do those connect up to how we're valuing lives?
Yeah.
Because the key worry in the book is rich people's lives or people in rich countries are being valued more than other people's lives unfairly, right?
Yeah, exactly. Great question. So when we're trying to add up all of these benefits and costs and cost benefit analysis, one thing that economists use is something called willingness to pay. And so you can think of this as, what are you willing to pay to get something? There are a lot of costs and benefits that are easy to capture in money terms, where a government is spending so much money to get a carton of vaccines or a box of donuts, whatever the government's buying. That's easy to capture. But there are other things that are harder to capture. So how much does someone value the aesthetics of the beauty of having a park outside of their house and to be able to see that? How much does someone value reducing their chance of death by 1 in 1,000? These things are harder to capture. And so what economists use to capture that is this willingness to pay concept. So how much would you be willing to pay to have a park outside your apartment? Or how much would you be willing to pay to do that? And then that's captured in a benefit. So if I would be willing to pay $1,000 a year for a park outside my window, that's captured as a $1,000 benefit if the government decides to build a park next to my house. And so one of the comparison, that's absolute willingness to pay. The concern that I raise in the book is that absolute willingness to pay is problematic because if I have $100 million, I can say, you know what, I'd be willing to pay $1 million for a view outside my apartment. Yeah, I feel like I'd be willing to pay that. And someone that has only $10,000 to their name and says they'd be willing to pay $1,000 for the view outside their apartment, as the economists are framing it, the person who's paying $1,000 is 1,000 times less the benefit they're really getting for the view. And so we should go build the park next to the rich person's apartment. And what I argue in the book is that the better way to judge how much benefit someone's getting isn't this absolute value, but it's a percentage value of how much you have. So if I have $10,000 and I'd be willing to spend 10% of that, $1,000 on the view, I value that more than someone that has $100 million and they'd only be willing to spend $1 million. They'd only be willing to spend 1% of their wealth on this. And so the percentage there is saying a better way to capture how much someone actually values something and how much benefit someone really gets isn't the absolute amount that they have, because that's really just a feature of how much money they have. It's the percentage of their wealth. And so the last question on value of lives. So economists, one of the benefits we can have is a reduction in mortality risk. So let's say we have a law that says everyone has to wear a seatbelt. Everyone across the population gets a certain benefit from that. They're having a lower chance of death. And so what would you be willing to pay for that benefit? Well, most people want to live and so would be willing to pay a certain amount for the benefit of having a lower chance of death. And what happens is we find that when we ask people, lo and behold, the wealthier people are willing to pay more and the poor people are willing to pay less, simply because they have less to pay. And when you calculate what's called the value of a statistical life, so the average life saved by a policy, you get people who are in wealthy countries with $10, $20 million values of statistical life, and people who are in poorer countries with $60,000 for a value of statistical life. And there's this huge difference. But when you calculate using percentage willingness to pay, amazingly, all the differences come out in the wash, and everyone has essentially almost exactly the same value of statistical life calculated in terms of the percentage they'd be willing to pay for a small reduction in their chance of death. So sorry, that was a couple questions, but hopefully that explains some of the concepts in there.
No, I think that's very helpful. And there's actually an appendix in the back of the book that we're discussing, Are All Lives Equal, that has country by country what the value of a statistical life is. And I mean, you can see them side by side, and vary, quite considerably. So it's quite interesting to look at it and to see like where the really high value places are.
Mm-hmm.
You know? We're up there, the U.S., but there's like Australia has a higher value of statistical life than the U.S. in these obviously Norway and the Scandinavian countries do as well. But getting to actually see those numbers, I think, is quite important.
Mm-hmm.
So you use the VSL here, the value of the statistical life, as one of your main underpinnings for making a lot of these arguments. I guess this was maybe another small critique.
Sure.
I was like, I wanted more arguments along those lines to actually get you to this kind of well-being.
Mm-hmm.
Because a lot of times, like, okay, how much to reduce risk or to I guess take a more dangerous job, which are very valid arguments for this, but I wanted something a little bit more comprehensive.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I'm trying to walk here is on this line of saying there are a lot of different ways. So I propose percentage willingness to pay. I think there's a lot of there's a lot of different ways that you can get at some of these concepts. You could do a statistical exercise to control for wealth or income in a different way when you're doing your initial calculations. And so I'm trying, there's a certain level to which I'm trying not to put forward this is absolutely the best way to measure welfare or measure utility. It's to say rather that, and this is the opportunity cost piece a bit, this is a better way across the board to measure whatever that concept is than what we're doing right now. What we're doing right now fails in terms of accuracy, fails in terms of justice, fails in terms of all these pieces. And so we have a better option we could shift to. And I don't know if that's the right option. I don't know if it's the perfect option. I don't know if welfare or utility is what we should be measuring, or preferences or happiness or what have you. But it seems like any of those concepts is better captured by this percentage thing than the absolute piece. But I definitely take the point that digging into that argument is it's a place perhaps for future writings for sure.
Right. So just I love when you were talking about just a little bit of the in chapter 6 promoting things that are beneficial and have utility that people don't want. Mm-hmm. And I wanted to go into that, and then later on I think in like chapter maybe 14 or something, I was like, and that will be for another book. And I'm like, oh darn, not getting there. But we're about at the end of our time. Is there anything you want to cap off when not your final thought, but just like something else you want to get out there?
No, I mean, just that the book is available. It's available in paperback. It's now available in ebook form for anyone that's interested. The first chapter is available for free. Oh. Anyone can read it. You can check out the website if you want to learn more, or the channel with that. But yeah, overall, thank you all so much for having me on the program. This has been a lot of fun. And thank you for the great work that you all do, making public philosophy out there, making it more engaging for people and getting people interested in philosophy.
All right. So once again, here's the book that we've been talking about. Are All Lives Equal? Why Cost-Benefit Analysis Values Rich Lives More, and How Philosophy Can Fix It.
So as our guest, we'll let you take us out on a final word, a quote from your book. So what do you have for us?
Fantastic. So I'll pull something from the first chapter. In the first chapter, one of the things that I center is this memo from Lawrence Summers that kind of outlines that these rich lives are worth so much more than these poor lives. So I'll take a quote specifically this one thing about Summers that I think is really impactful, which is, whether you think the memo was written as a critique of the basic economic principles that place lower value on the lives of the poor, or a manifesto supporting such a view, doesn't change the underlying economic logic. Summers is factually correct about what economics implies, even if he's morally wrong.